My argument is that liberalism as a political, social, economic project has failed not because it has failed to live up to its own aspirations, but precisely because it has succeeded in what it set out to do. What it set out to do was to create a world in which human beings would be largely liberated from each other, and particularly liberated from each other through the mechanisms of a depersonalized state and a depersonalized market. And the more people have found that they are free of each other, the more that they have found they are also subjects to the forces of a globalized market and an increasingly distant state. And so it seems to me that many of our political crises today, what we're seeing across the West, is a reaction simultaneously against a sense of powerlessness in relationship to a globalized market. I think this is part of what's happening with Brexit, part of what's happening with the rise of populism around the West. I think it's contributed to Donald Trump's ascent. Perhaps the part of my book that received the most attention was to describe liberalism as having both a left and a right, or as a liberal, progressive, and conservative dimension. And so in many ways to indict and to characterize what we would see as the great divide in the Western world between conservative and progressive, as in many ways sharing the same basic philosophy of liberalism. And the great debate over the last half century has been one over means, particularly the means of the depersonalized mechanism of the market for the political right, and the depersonalized mechanism of the state for the political left. But both of these end up, in a way, empowering both of these mechanisms. So it has been less that the state waxes, the state grows in its powers as the market wanes, or vice versa. Both have increased as we become more and more fractured or fragmented. I think in some ways it's, I think of being in a political order as a little bit like being in a fish tank where, like a fish that can't see the water. And I think living in a political order always means that you're not able to see the nature of that political order. You're not able to see the deepest sort of presuppositions. And maybe more than that, liberalism is a philosophy that argues that we are free to make ourselves, that we exist in a condition in which we are uninhibited to make ourselves. And yet the irony is that belief is itself shaped by this liberal order. So I think to see the paradox of the way in which our own psyche is shaped by an order that otherwise claims that we are free, that's a kind of revelation that I think many of my readers have come away understanding, that even a philosophy of freedom ends up in some ways managing the kinds of human beings that we are. I suppose it was the culmination of about 15 years of thinking about, in many ways, the deep inherent challenges of our own political order. You know, I came of age around the time when the Soviet Union fell, when communism fell. Francis Fukuyama wrote famously, "The End of History." There was a sense that the great questions of politics had been solved, right? The question of what is the best political order? How should we organize ourselves? What's the best way to shape a political order? It seemed that question had been settled finally and irrefutably, that there was no more question. And this seemed to me to be, at the very least, problematic, if not overly sanguine, if not overly optimistic. So I began just exploring the ways in which it seemed to me the liberal order contained, in many ways, contained sort of the seeds of its own weakness. This is an old way of examining political orders. It goes all the way back to Plato. Alexis de Tocqueville engaged in this. And I think it's especially necessary when there's a sense of triumphalism that's rampant in a political And I would say that the deepest problems of the liberal political order lie in a theory of human nature. It's less institutional, although that might be part of it. It's less how we organize our political parties. Of course, it touches on our economic system. But I think at the root level, the problem of liberalism is an anthropological problem. It's a problem of the theory of human nature. It's the idea of the human being as this autonomous, self-making self. And I think many of our pathologies today arise from this disordered understanding of human nature. So I would say that if there is an alternative to liberalism, in some ways it's more radical than most people think, because it requires a real rethinking of what human nature is. But in some ways it might be less radical in the sense that it doesn't necessarily require a complete transformation of our political order. It seems to me if you populated our political order with different anthropological assumptions, that order itself would reflect those changes, and in many ways you could largely work within the institutions, but it seems to me those institutions themselves would work rather differently.